biggest mistake when you're drawing anatomy is overshading. I will get into that later, but before this, there are actually 6 other draftsmanship mistakes you can correct to draw better anatomy right now. To break them all down, I'm studying Wonbin Lee, a Korean artist that draws some really stunning character illustrations. From his work, we will uncover the 7 deadly sins of anatomy drawing. Let's go. Quick thanks for today's sponsor, Squarespace, the all-in-one website platform for creatives and entrepreneurs. This is probably the single most crucial thing you need to learn well before even touching human bodies. Wait, that came out kind of wrong. Everything here is perspective, and here are some examples done by me. If your eyes are sharp, you will notice that the perspective of the torso and the hips here are way off. In Wonbin's piece, however, there's a clear understanding of how objects are placed and move in a 3D space. These mistakes can oftentimes be really hard to spot when you're on your own. All the subtle differences between our drawings come from understanding perspective. Perspective also goes hand in hand with proportions. I will talk about this more in detail later, but the sooner you can master perspective, the sooner you can pose the body around accurately at any angle without relying heavily on references. And a secret training you need to do is to practice how to rotate forms in space. Once you got that down, then remembering common landmarks like the iliac crest, sternum, clavicles, and the ribs will help you so much more in building details on top of that basic form. If you can't even do the basic forms comfortably, adding on all these extra details will only frustrate, confuse, and bamboozle you, especially when you're trying to draw bodies at different angles. I have 2 videos on perspective here if you want a deeper dive into the topic. But speaking of these landmarks, did you know that over 90% of the cool muscle names that you're trying so hard to memorize aren't really that important to learn at all? If you're focusing too much on all the scientific names, you end up just learning a bunch of names. Well, unless you're doing medical illustrations, I guess, but for the average anime enjoyer who wants to draw decent anatomy on as many different poses as possible, these are a little excessive. For beginners especially, here are a few important ones that you should absolutely know, but basically you just want to focus on the big visible muscles that you usually see in normal people. I repeat, normal people. Just for reference, when I say normal, I mean the most common body type that people usually draw, not like too shredded, but they're still leanish. The shoulders, the quads, the gastro, whatever, and some of the stuff up here like the SCM and the trapezius are all things you most likely see in whatever body type you're drawing, so it makes sense for you to prioritize focusing on those. The precious brain space and time used for memorizing these little muscles are better spent doing rotation drawings of simplified versions of these bigger forms, which brings us to the stuff that you should actually study. The most slept on thing when it comes to anatomy is probably the skeleton. Literally, this is the best use case of the quote, "The inside is what matters most." By understanding how the skeleton works and moves, not only do your posing becomes more intuitive and natural, but you can also avoid drawing these weird ranges of motions that doesn't really make much sense anatomically. Studying the bones will also help you remember common landmarks on the body. For example, the shape of the clavicles, these protrusions of the spine where the neck travels forward, the hip bone and the rib cage, the distance between them, and things like that. These examples by Wonbin Lee is exactly what I was talking about. Just a simple drawing of the clavicles here already shows so much of his knowledge. It extends all the way to the shoulders like this, like what you're seeing here in the skeleton diagram. This subtle curve-in also suggests the placement of the rib cage here, and then the perfect amount of space to start the hips here. Very subtle in actual illustration, but this is the foundation to everything. Think of the skin and meat like cloth that hangs from a wireframe. This doesn't translate to you drawing good bodies immediately, but it sets up good foundation of the structure when you do your studies on muscles eventually. Plus, it gives you a good chance to practice posing because the skeleton is much more straightforward to draw in perspective compared to the fully fleshed forms. Which brings us directly to the next mistake. But before we get into that, let me tell you more about Squarespace. Grinding to learn new skills like anatomy is fine, but I believe any artist should always put out their work no matter the skill level. Squarespace is a perfect website builder for you to do that. It's clean, slick, and so intuitive. You can even do it with an empty head. If you're someone who's taking commissions, then not only does Squarespace provide built-in payment tools that allows you to sell prints and digital products, but they also have advanced scheduling tools to make it super easy to manage your clients. You can also register for a super cool custom domain like this to make your website feel authentic and give it some personality. They give a 14-day free trial as well, so once you have your site ready, head to my link in the description below and use code RICEBRUSH to save 10% off your first purchase. Thank you Squarespace again for supporting the channel. Not respecting the jiggle physics is the absolute worst sin so far. This is probably obvious, but the meat and muscles, they move, squish, and stretches. And I don't just mean these specific body parts, but the entire body. Look at this little indication here by Wonbin Lee that the breasts are resting over the arm that's supporting it, or here the little squish when the hips shoot up like that. Paying attention to details like that is 100% going to improve your anatomy so much. They're not only going to make your drawings much more believable, but it adds another layer of oomph to it as well. Depending on how the characters are posed, gravity will affect how the body looks. If the character is lying down like this, then because of gravity, all the flesh will gather downwards like this. Or when two body parts touch together, they'll squish around like this, creating this squeezed shape like this, trying to keep it professional, you know. Keep in mind that the thighs are resting on top of a flat surface as well, so the extra flesh gets pushed to the sides like this at the bottom, while gravity is pulling the whole form down slightly. Don't do it too much. If you look at the cross section of the front view, you understand how everything comes together. This differs from body part to body part and how, I guess, well endowed your character is, so they take a lot of trial and error. One very useful tool to help you when you're studying how the muscles contract and stretches during movement is using a site like Scott Eaton's Bodies in Motion. There are frame-by-frame breakdowns of a specific set of movements for you to really see how a body part changes in shape when it moves around. But if there is a technique to make studying all these things much easier, it would be the silhouette, aka negative space. Remember how we talked about remembering names? Well, in this context, focusing on the silhouette is really helpful because you most likely just need to know the muscles that directly contribute to the silhouette of a pose. Except for the abs, of course, they're really important. Not only that, if you learn how to switch your brain from 3D to 2D mode, you will instantly see the subtle mistakes on the positioning of the body parts here. Asking questions like, why is it curving higher here in the reference? Or why is the curve breaking over here? Will really help you understand the 3D shape of that body part that you're studying. For example, in this drawing I did earlier, if you look closer to the silhouette of the hips here, the start of the legs here isn't really aligned properly to the other side, so the hip just looks lopsided compared to the original drawing by Wonbin. It's also very helpful to study the silhouette of the legs here, even if you don't exactly know the structure of the leg muscles too much. You can tell that there's a muscle here, one there, or noticing things like this C curve is always lower than this one. And when you rotate the legs around to a different angle, you will see that it's basically the same thing, but the angle is just different. Another mistake that you're probably making in 90% of your drawings is proportions. A lot of the issues you see in these drawings on screen can be solved by just knowing some basic proportion rules. And yeah, you gotta memorize some of these, but having a sheet like this on the side whenever you're drawing can be very helpful. The thing is, these are such easy to fix mistakes, it's almost a crime to ignore them. Different length limbs when they're positioned differently, especially in perspective, weird foreshortenings, especially in extreme angles like these, and inconsistent torso lengths are all very common proportion mistakes. And all the examples I listed are things you would know just by studying the skeleton. So once you have the basics down, you can go a level deeper by studying the different proportions for specific muscle groups. And really, this will help you a lot in knowing how to draw these curves accurately, instead of just guessing it every time you study from a reference. You basically want to find a way to divide the body into equal part boxes or something like that, so that it's easier to apply those perspective skills later on. And like what I mentioned at the start of the video, overshading is probably what's killing your anatomy drawings. Even if you get the structure and the lines perfectly, a lot of us will still mess up during the shading phase. So let's let's look at how Wonbin does it. While it's clear that the muscle forms here are all present, look at how subtle the value transition here is. The values barely dip by percent from here to here. This is the classic optical illusion example you have probably seen floating around on the internet, and that's exactly what's happening here. Once you understand this concept, you will stop using the same shadow values across everything, and your drawings will look much more subtle and realistic. I personally like to find the biggest shadow shapes like this first, and then I slowly fine-tune the forms inside the shadow by color picking and making sure I do not drop too low in values. For example, this shadow here will never be darker than this one here. So using some examples from my friend Ruru, since it's quite hard to find male character examples from Wonbin, see how there's really only a few values here for the entire abs, and their values are really close together as well. The shadow side basically merges into one while it's more defined on the light side. By mastering the shading part of drawing anatomy, you're one step closer to creating beautiful illustrations. But if you don't know how to pose the bodies, you're missing out a ton. So click here to find out how Dino does it. Subscribe. Bye.